On his 70th birthday, he thought his family had gathered to celebrate him. Instead, they had a plan to take control of everything he had spent a lifetime building. But overnight, one unexpected decision changed their future forever. Stay until the end to discover the shocking twists, the hidden truth, and the unforgettable ending. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. I never imagined that my 70th birthday would be the day I began questioning everything I believed about my own family. My name is Valor Quinn Ashcombe, and for most of my life I considered myself a practical man. I spent 43 years as a civil engineer designing bridges, roads, and public infrastructure across 3 states. Every paycheck, every promotion, and every bonus went toward one goal: making sure my wife, Miriam, and our children would never have to struggle the way we did during our early years together. Miriam passed away 8 years before this story began, leaving me alone in the farmhouse we had restored with our own hands. The house stood on a quiet hill outside Ashridge Hollow, surrounded by maple trees and open fields. It was peaceful there, and I had grown used to the silence. I believed retirement would be a chapter of reflection, gardening, reading, and occasionally spoiling my grandchildren. Instead, it became the beginning of a lesson I never expected to learn. A month before my birthday, my eldest son, Draven Quinn Ashcombe, called me with unusual enthusiasm. Draven was 46 years old and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had always believed success was inevitable. He owned several luxury fitness clubs across the region and enjoyed reminding everyone that he had built them from nothing. I was proud of him, or at least I thought I was. During that phone call, he insisted that the family wanted to celebrate my birthday somewhere special instead of gathering at my farmhouse like we usually did. "Dad," he said with a cheerful laugh, "turning 70 only happens once. Let us do something unforgettable." I hesitated because I preferred quiet dinners at home, but he kept insisting. My younger children supported the idea as well. They told me I deserved a proper celebration after everything I had done for the family. Their excitement sounded genuine, and after a few days I finally agreed. They reserved a private dining hall at an elegant countryside resort nearly an hour away from my home. Every detail had already been arranged before I even accepted the invitation. Looking back now, I should have noticed how unusual that was. The morning of my birthday arrived with clear skies and warm sunlight. I drove myself to the resort, enjoying the familiar country roads that cut through rolling farmland. During the drive, I found myself smiling at old memories. I remembered teaching Draven how to ride a bicycle. I remembered helping my daughters with science projects at the kitchen table. I remembered family vacations where money was tight but laughter came easily. Those memories comforted me. They reminded me why I had worked so hard throughout my career. Every overtime shift had been for them. When I arrived at the resort, several staff members greeted me by name before leading me toward a beautifully decorated banquet room. Balloons, flowers, framed family photographs, and a large banner wishing me a happy 70th birthday filled the room. Soft piano music played in the background. At first glance, everything appeared perfect. My children hugged me one after another, and my grandchildren ran toward me with handmade birthday cards. I genuinely believed I was about to enjoy one of the happiest days of my retirement. Still, something felt different almost immediately. It wasn't anything obvious. It was a collection of tiny moments that made me uneasy. Whenever I entered a conversation between my children, they suddenly changed the subject. If I stepped outside for fresh air and returned a few minutes later, the room became strangely quiet before someone forced a smile and started talking about something completely unrelated. At first I dismissed it as coincidence. Families often prepare surprises during birthday parties, I told myself. Perhaps they were simply trying not to ruin whatever gift they had planned. Lunch was served shortly after noon. The food was excellent, and everyone complimented the chef. Yet even during the meal, the conversation slowly drifted toward subjects I found oddly specific. Retirement planning, estate management, investment portfolios, long-term financial security. My youngest daughter casually mentioned how complicated online banking had become. Another son joked that technology moved too fast for older people. Draven listened carefully before leaning toward me with a sympathetic expression. "Dad," he said, cutting his steak with deliberate calm, "you've spent your whole life managing responsibilities. Maybe it's time someone managed things for you." His words sounded harmless, In fact, everyone at the table nodded as though he had expressed something thoughtful. I smiled politely and replied that I was doing just fine. I still handled my own investments, paid my own bills, and met with my accountant every quarter. My health was good and my mind remained sharp. I had no intention of giving up control over my affairs simply because I had reached another birthday. The conversation moved on, but only briefly. Throughout the afternoon, similar comments continued appearing from different directions. Someone mentioned how difficult financial paperwork could become. Someone else joked that scams often targeted elderly people. Every remark sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they began forming a pattern that I couldn't ignore. By the time dessert arrived, I realized nearly every major conversation had somehow returned to my finances. That was the first moment I stopped enjoying my own birthday. I smiled for photographs and thanked everyone for coming, but a quiet question settled in the back of my mind. Why did everyone suddenly seem so interested in convincing me that I was no longer capable of managing the life I had built? I didn't know it yet, but the answer to that question was waiting just a few hours away. And once I heard it, nothing in my family would ever be the same again. The birthday celebration continued long after lunch, but the warmth I had felt when I first arrived slowly disappeared beneath a growing sense of discomfort. Everyone laughed at the right moments, the grandchildren played on the lawn outside the banquet hall, and waiters continued bringing coffee and desserts to the table. On the surface, it looked like the perfect family gathering. Yet every time I looked around the room, I caught brief exchanges of eye contact between my children that stopped the moment I noticed them. It reminded me of business meetings from my engineering career, when executives silently communicated before presenting a proposal they had already agreed upon behind closed doors. I tried convincing myself that I was imagining things. Age had taught me not to jump to conclusions. Still, experience had also taught me to trust patterns instead of isolated moments. Bridges did not collapse because of one visible crack. They failed because dozens of unnoticed weaknesses eventually connected into one dangerous problem. My family was beginning to feel exactly like that. Later that afternoon, Draven approached me carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to me with an easy smile and suggested we take a short walk around the resort gardens. The pathways were lined with trimmed hedges and colorful flowers, while small fountains filled the air with the sound of flowing water. It was quiet enough that we could speak privately without anyone overhearing us. "I've been thinking about you a lot lately, Dad," he began. I thanked him, assuming he wanted to talk about retirement or perhaps Miriam. Instead, he surprised me. "You've earned the right to stop worrying about money." I chuckled softly. "I'm not worried about money." "Exactly," he replied. "Because you've been responsible. But responsibility also means knowing when to let the next generation take over." The sentence lingered between us. It sounded respectful, yet something about the way he emphasized the last few words unsettled me. "I still enjoy managing my own affairs," I answered calmly. He nodded as though he had expected that response. "Of course you do. Nobody's saying otherwise." For a few minutes we discussed harmless subjects, including gardening and one of my grandchildren who had recently started college. Then Draven suddenly changed direction. "Our financial advisor is here today." I stopped walking. "Your financial advisor?" He was already nearby for another meeting. I asked him to stop by for a few minutes. I stared at him, unsure whether I had heard correctly. "You invited a financial advisor to my birthday?" "It's nothing formal," he said quickly. "Just a conversation." Before I could respond, he gently guided me toward one of the resort's private meeting rooms located beside the conference wing. My heartbeat slowed, not because I was relaxed but because I immediately became cautious. Engineers learn to observe details before making decisions. The room we entered already contained bottled water, folders, and neatly arranged chairs. Nothing about it looked spontaneous. A man in an expensive navy suit stood to greet me. "Mr. Ashcombe, it's an honor to meet you. My name is Calvin Rhodes." We shook hands politely, and I sat down without removing my jacket. Draven closed the door behind us. Calvin opened one of the folders and smiled with practiced confidence. "Draven has shared how carefully you've planned your retirement. Congratulations. Few people reach your level of financial stability." I thanked him, waiting for the real purpose of the meeting. "It may be time," Calvin continued, "to simplify everything. He slid several pages across the table. This management arrangement would allow trusted family members to oversee your investments, coordinate tax planning, approve larger financial decisions, and reduce administrative burdens. I glanced through the documents without reading every line. Certain phrases immediately caught my attention. Authorization, decision-making authority, investment discretion, asset management. None of those words belonged in a casual birthday conversation. I looked directly at Draven. When exactly did you arrange this? A couple of weeks ago. So this meeting was planned before you even invited me? He hesitated for only a second. We wanted everything ready in case you agreed. The answer struck me harder than I expected. This wasn't an idea that had appeared during lunch. It had been organized long before I arrived. The decorations, the speeches, even the private walk through the garden suddenly felt less like acts of love, and more like carefully placed steps leading me toward this room. Calvin spoke again. Nothing transfers ownership today. This simply gives your children the ability to act on your behalf if needed. If needed. I repeated. Exactly. Think of it as preparing for the future. I closed the folder. I appreciate the concern, but I didn't ask for this. Draven leaned forward, keeping his voice soft. Dad, you're making this more complicated than it has to be. No, I answered. Someone else already made it complicated. The room became noticeably quieter. For the first time that afternoon, Draven's smile disappeared completely. His expression hardened for just a moment before returning to something that looked almost friendly. You don't trust us? I answered honestly. I trust people who ask before making plans about my life. Neither of them spoke. I stood, picked up my car keys, and walked toward the door. Before leaving, I turned back one final time. I came here expecting to celebrate my birthday. I didn't come here to surrender control of my finances. Without waiting for another response, I left the meeting room and returned to the banquet hall. My children tried acting as though nothing unusual had happened, but I noticed how carefully they watched my face for the rest of the evening. They weren't wondering whether I had enjoyed the celebration anymore. They were wondering whether I might still change my mind. As I drove home under the fading light of sunset, the silence inside my truck felt heavier than ever before. I replayed every conversation from the day in my head, fitting each piece into place like sections of a blueprint. By the time I reached my farmhouse, one conclusion had become impossible to ignore. My birthday party had never been the real event. It had only been the setting. The real purpose had been hidden inside that conference room all along. For the next 3 days, my phone never stopped ringing. At first, the calls seemed harmless. My youngest daughter asked whether I had made it home safely after the party. One of my sons wanted to know if I enjoyed the photo album they had given me. Even Draven left a cheerful voicemail saying he hoped I hadn't misunderstood the meeting at the resort. If I had only listened to their words, I might have believed they were simply checking on me. But experience had taught me that timing often reveals more than language. Every conversation somehow drifted back toward the same subject before it ended. Dad, have you thought about what Calvin explained? You don't have to decide right away, but it would give everyone peace of mind. We're only trying to help. The words were different each time, yet the message never changed. They wanted an answer. More specifically, they wanted the answer they expected me to give. I politely refused to discuss the documents over the phone. Eventually, the calls became less frequent, but the uncomfortable feeling remained. I decided that before speaking to any of my children again, I needed facts instead of assumptions. On Thursday morning, I drove into Rivermore City for my quarterly appointment with my accountant, Leonard Huxley. Leonard had managed my taxes and investment records for nearly 25 years. He was not the kind of man who exaggerated problems or spread rumors. If something concerned him, there was usually a solid reason behind it. His office occupied the second floor of a brick building overlooking the old courthouse square. The waiting room was quiet when I arrived, so I sat near the window while his assistant prepared copies of several tax documents I wanted to review. Leonard was finishing another appointment in the conference room across the hallway, and the door had been left slightly open. I had no intention of listening to someone else's conversation. Then I heard my own last name. Ashcombe's reputation still carries weight with investors, one unfamiliar voice said. Another replied, If his father backs the restructuring, lenders will probably extend the deadlines. My attention sharpened immediately. The son seems confident the family assets will be available soon. I remained perfectly still. No one inside that room realized I could hear them. The old man hasn't signed anything yet, the first voice answered. But according to Draven, it's only a matter of time. My chest tightened. They weren't discussing possibilities. They were discussing expectations. A few moments later, chairs scraped across the floor, signaling that the meeting had ended. I looked away from the hallway before anyone stepped outside. Two men in expensive business suits walked past the waiting area without recognizing me from the brief birthday celebration. They left the building still talking quietly about financing schedules and investor confidence. Leonard called me into his office a few minutes later. First, we reviewed ordinary paperwork, dividend statements, tax estimates, retirement account performance. Everything looked exactly as expected. Finally, I closed the folder and looked directly at him. "Leonard," I said, "I need to ask you something and I want a completely honest answer." He removed his glasses and folded his hands together. "When have I ever given you anything else?" I nodded. "Has Draven contacted you recently?" The expression on Leonard's face changed just enough for me to notice. "Yes." "About my accounts?" "Indirectly." I waited. He asked general questions about estate administration and whether certain assets would eventually become accessible through inheritance. I felt my stomach tighten. Did he ask for confidential information? "No," Leonard answered immediately. "And I refused to discuss anything specific." That relieved me slightly. Then Leonard reached into one of his desk drawers and removed a business card. This arrived 2 weeks ago. The card belonged to an investment consulting firm I had never heard of. They called several times asking whether you intended to restructure your holdings through family management. I never authorized anyone to suggest that. "I know," Leonard replied quietly. "That's why I declined every conversation." For several long seconds neither of us spoke. Finally I asked the question that had been growing in my mind ever since leaving the resort. "Do you think this is about protecting me?" Leonard leaned back in his chair before answering. "I think someone believes your financial stability could solve a very expensive problem." He did not mention Draven by name. He didn't need to. As our meeting ended, Leonard walked me to the lobby. Before I reached the front door, he stopped me. "Vaylor." I turned. "Be careful before signing anything over the next few weeks. People under financial pressure often convince themselves they're acting for the right reasons." His warning stayed with me during the drive home. The countryside looked exactly as it always had. Fields stretched toward the horizon, tractors moved slowly across distant farms, and the afternoon sun reflected off small ponds beside the highway. Everything outside my truck appeared peaceful. Inside my mind, however, pieces were finally beginning to connect. The birthday party, the prepared documents, the advisor waiting in a private conference room, the businessmen discussing my finances as though decisions had already been made. Someone had been telling investors that my money would soon become available. Not because I had agreed, because they expected to persuade me. That evening I unlocked the front door of my farmhouse, set my briefcase on the kitchen table, and poured myself a cup of coffee. Before I could even take the first sip, I noticed a large envelope resting inside my mailbox slot. There was no return address, only my name written neatly across the front. Something told me that whatever was inside would answer questions I hadn't even thought to ask yet. I carried the envelope into the kitchen without opening it immediately. Years of working on large engineering projects had taught me that rushing toward an answer often created bigger problems than waiting a few minutes. I poured my coffee, sat at the old oak table Miriam and I had built decades earlier, and carefully examined the package. There was no postage stamp because someone had delivered it by hand. My name was written in neat block letters with a black ink pen. Nothing else appeared on the front. I opened it with a letter opener and found several neatly organized documents inside. The first page contained no greeting. "Mr. Ashcombe, you do not know me personally, but I believe you deserve information before making any decisions involving your estate. Please read everything before contacting your family." There was no signature. Beneath the letter were copies of publicly available corporate filings, financial statements, and newspaper clippings. At first they seemed unrelated, but as I continued reading, one name appeared again and again. Draven Quinn Ashcombe. The records showed that 3 of his fitness clubs had recently been used as collateral for expansion loans. Another document revealed that 2 commercial properties had been refinanced within the past 18 months. Then came something even more alarming. A supplier had filed a lawsuit claiming unpaid invoices worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Another creditor had issued a formal demand for immediate repayment. None of this had ever been mentioned to me. My first reaction was disbelief. Draven had always projected confidence. Every holiday gathering included stories about new locations, ambitious plans, and record-breaking memberships. He drove expensive cars, wore tailored suits, and spoke like a man who had complete control over his business empire. The papers on my kitchen table described someone fighting to keep that empire from collapsing. I spent nearly an hour reviewing every page before noticing a business card tucked into the bottom of the envelope. Eloan Harrow, attorney at law, trust and estate planning. A handwritten note appeared on the back. If you wish to understand why I sent these documents, call me. I stared at the card for several minutes before picking up my phone. The call lasted less than 30 seconds. After introducing myself, I asked whether she had time to meet. Her answer came immediately. I've been hoping you would call. The following morning I drove to Rivermore City once again. Eloan's office occupied the top floor of a renovated historic building overlooking the river. Unlike the polished corporate offices I had visited throughout my career, her workspace felt practical rather than luxurious. Shelves filled with legal books covered one wall, while framed engineering blueprints decorated another. That detail caught my attention. "You noticed them," she said as she welcomed me inside. "I did. My father was a structural engineer. That's actually how I first heard your name many years ago." We sat across from one another in a small conference room. She offered coffee, which I accepted, and then opened a folder identical to the documents I had received. "I suppose the first question is why you sent these." She nodded. "Because I recognized your name during a routine trust consultation involving one of Draven's lenders." I frowned. "You represented the lender?" "No. I represented a separate client whose investments could have been affected if additional financing was approved." She carefully chose every word. "I cannot discuss confidential details, but everything I mailed to you came from public records that anyone can legally obtain." She slid another document toward me. "This is the important part." It summarized a series of corporate obligations due within the next several weeks. If refinancing failed, several loans could enter default almost simultaneously. I looked up. "How serious is this?" "Serious enough that new private capital would dramatically improve his position. And he believes that capital could come from me." She met my eyes. "I believe he has convinced more than one business associate that your financial support is likely." The room became painfully quiet. For several moments I simply studied the numbers in front of me. They painted a picture far different from the successful image Draven proudly displayed to the family. "I don't understand something," I finally said. "If he needed help, why didn't he simply ask?" Eloan answered without hesitation. "Because asking leaves room for rejection. Creating expectations makes rejection much harder." That sentence stayed with me. She wasn't accusing my son of committing a crime. She was describing a strategy, one built on pressure instead of honesty. Before our meeting ended, Eloan asked a question I had been avoiding. "When was the last time you reviewed your will?" I leaned back slowly. "About 5 years ago." "And does it still reflect what you want if circumstances have changed?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I thought about the birthday party, the prepared paperwork, the conference room, the conversations with investors, the growing pressure to surrender control. For the first time since turning 70, I realized this situation was no longer about protecting my savings. It was about protecting the purpose behind everything I had spent a lifetime building. As I stood to leave, Eloan walked me to the elevator. "I won't tell you what decisions to make," she said quietly. "That's your choice. But whatever you decide, make sure it reflects your values instead of someone else's urgency." During the drive back to Ashridge Hollow, I never turned on the radio. I didn't need distractions. By the time I reached my farmhouse, my mind was made up. Before the sun rose the next morning, I would contact my own estate attorney. If my children believed my will guaranteed them control over everything I owned, they were about to discover just how quickly a lifetime of careful planning could take a completely different direction. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same images replaying in my mind. The birthday decorations. The conference room hidden behind the banquet hall. Draven smiling as though he were offering me freedom, while quietly asking me to surrender control over everything I had spent decades building. By 4:30 the next morning, I gave up on sleep entirely. I brewed a pot of coffee, watched the sunrise through the kitchen window, and accepted something I had resisted for days. I could no longer treat this as a misunderstanding. Whether my children realized it or not, they had crossed a line by making plans for my future without inviting me into the conversation first. At exactly 8 o'clock, I arrived at the office of my longtime estate attorney Malcolm Fenwick. Malcolm had drafted my original will shortly after Miriam passed away. He knew my family, understood the structure of my investments, and had often reminded me that a will should evolve as life changed. At the time I had assumed there would never be a reason to rewrite it. Sitting across from him that morning I realized how wrong I had been. He welcomed me into his office with his usual calm professionalism. "Vaylor," he said, "it's good to see you. I wasn't expecting your call quite so urgently." "I wasn't expecting to make it," I replied. He immediately noticed the seriousness in my voice. After the door closed, I spent nearly an hour explaining everything that had happened since my birthday. I described the carefully arranged meeting at the resort, the management documents, the conversations with Leonard, the corporate records Aloan had shown me, and my growing concern that my estate had become part of financial expectations I had never approved. Malcolm listened without interrupting. When I finished, he folded his hands together and asked only one question. "What outcome do you want?" Not what my children deserved. Not what would make headlines. Not what would punish anyone. Simply what outcome reflected my own values. I had been thinking about that question throughout the drive to his office. "I still want my children to receive something from me," I answered. "But I no longer want my life's work to become the solution for someone's business mistakes." Malcolm nodded slowly. "Then we should separate inheritance from control." Over the next several hours we redesigned my estate plan from the ground up. Instead of distributing the majority of my assets directly to my children, we established the Ashcombe Engineering Scholarship Foundation. Its purpose would be simple: provide full scholarships to talented students from small rural communities who wanted to study engineering, architecture, or infrastructure management. I knew firsthand how difficult higher education could be for families with limited financial resources. If my wealth could create opportunities for generations of young people instead of disappearing into debt repayment, then I believed Miriam would have approved. My children would each receive carefully defined personal inheritances. Enough to remember me with gratitude, but nowhere near enough to assume control over the investment portfolio itself. Independent trustees would oversee every major financial decision. No family member could remove them or replace them for personal gain. The structure ensured that the foundation could continue operating regardless of family disagreements. When the final draft was complete, Malcolm read every page aloud. Nothing had been rushed. Every sentence reflected deliberate choices rather than emotional reactions. By late afternoon, witnesses arrived. Each signature was completed according to legal procedure. Every document was notarized, copied, and securely registered before the office closed for the day. As Malcolm placed the completed file into his records cabinet, he looked at me with quiet understanding. "How do you feel?" I considered the question carefully. "I expected to feel angry," I admitted. "Instead, I feel relieved." Relief surprised me. I wasn't celebrating the fact that my children would receive less than they had probably expected. I was celebrating the fact that my estate finally represented the principles Miriam and I had spent our lives building together. That evening I returned to the farmhouse with a sense of peace I had not experienced since before my birthday. For the first time in weeks, the silence inside the house no longer felt lonely. It felt reassuring. The following morning, however, that peace lasted less than an hour. At 9:15 my phone rang. "Draven." I let it go to voicemail. 5 minutes later my youngest daughter called. Then another son. By lunchtime, I had received 9 missed calls and 6 text messages asking whether we could all meet as a family that weekend. The messages became increasingly urgent. Dad, we need to clear up some misunderstandings. Please don't make any major decisions before we talk. Draven says you've been getting bad advice. Can we all sit down together? I read every message without replying. Late that afternoon, another text arrived, this time from Draven himself. Dad, this affects all of us now. Please don't do anything you'll regret. I stared at that sentence for a long time. He still didn't know. The decisions had already been made. The documents had already been signed. The future he believed he could still influence had quietly changed less than 24 hours earlier. I placed my phone face down on the kitchen table and walked outside onto the front porch. The evening air was cool, and the fields surrounding the farmhouse stretched peacefully toward the horizon. For years I had believed protecting my family meant giving them everything I owned someday. Now I understood that true protection sometimes meant making difficult choices before it was too late. 2 days later, I agreed to attend one final family meeting. This time there would be no birthday decorations, no carefully prepared presentations, no surprise financial advisors waiting behind closed doors. Only the truth. And before that conversation ended, every secret that had been quietly shaping my family's future would finally come into the open. 2 days later, I drove back to Rivermore City for what I knew would be the most important conversation my family had ever had. My youngest daughter had reserved a private room at a quiet restaurant overlooking the river, believing neutral ground would help everyone stay calm. I arrived 10 minutes early and chose a seat where I could see the entrance. Years of leading engineering teams had taught me that difficult meetings rarely became easier by delaying them. One by one, my children walked into the room. Some greeted me with nervous smiles. Others barely made eye contact. Draven arrived last, carrying the same confident expression I had seen at my birthday party, although I noticed the confidence looked more rehearsed than genuine. For a few minutes we spoke about ordinary things. The grandchildren, summer weather, my vegetable garden. No one wanted to begin the real conversation. Finally, Draven folded his hands on the table and looked directly at me. Dad, we're all here because we're worried about you. I nodded politely. I know. You've been speaking with people who don't understand our family. I remained silent. They've convinced you that we're trying to take advantage of you. Still I said nothing. The silence seemed to frustrate him. Dad, say something. I slowly removed a folder from my briefcase and placed it on the table. I will. Everyone watched as I opened it. Inside were copies of the management documents Calvin Rhodes had presented at the resort, notes from my accountant confirming unsolicited inquiries about my estate, and public corporate filings showing the financial condition of Draven's businesses. No one reached for the papers. I spoke calmly. I've spent my entire career making decisions based on evidence instead of assumptions. So before I formed any conclusions, I gathered facts. Draven's expression immediately changed. Those records don't tell the whole story. They tell enough. One of my daughters looked at the documents with visible confusion. Draven, what is this? He hesitated. It's temporary cash flow pressure. Another son frowned. You never told us about lawsuits. I was handling it. You told us the business was expanding. It was. The conversation quickly shifted away from me. For the first time, my other children began asking questions I realized they had never asked before. Loan balances, refinancing attempts, missed payments, investor meetings. One answer after another revealed that Draven had carefully shared different pieces of information with different members of the family. None of them had understood the complete picture. My youngest daughter slowly turned toward him. So the birthday party. He looked away. It wasn't only about Dad. Those words settled over the room like heavy rain. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody slammed a fist against the table. Disappointment filled the silence more completely than anger ever could. After several long moments, Draven looked at me. I was trying to save everything I'd built. I know, I answered. I wasn't planning to steal from you. I know. I thought if I could stabilize the companies, I'd pay everything back. I believe you. He seemed surprised by my response. Then I reached into my briefcase once more and removed another folder. This is the part you don't know. I slid the papers toward him. He opened the first page. His face lost all color. This can't be right. It is. The room remained completely silent as my children realized what they were reading. 2 days earlier, I had legally signed a new will. The Ashcombe Engineering Scholarship Foundation would receive the overwhelming majority of my estate. Independent trustees would oversee every investment. My children would each receive meaningful personal inheritances, but none of them would ever control the assets that had supported our family for decades. Draven stared at the final page for what felt like an eternity. You already changed everything. Yes. You didn't even tell us. I met his eyes without anger. You planned to change my future without telling me first. He lowered his head. For the first time since my birthday, he had no prepared answer. The meeting ended quietly. There were no dramatic arguments and no threats of legal action. My daughters hugged me before leaving. My sons shook my hand with expressions that mixed sadness and understanding. Draven remained seated long after everyone else had gone. As I walked toward the restaurant entrance, I heard him call my name. Dad. I turned. I'm sorry. The apology sounded different from anything he had said before. It wasn't polished. It wasn't persuasive. It was simply tired. I nodded once. I hope one day you become more proud of rebuilding your life honestly than you ever were pretending everything was perfect. Those were the last words I spoke to him that afternoon. Over the following months, reality caught up with the choices everyone had made. Without access to my assets, Draven could no longer delay the financial problems surrounding his businesses. Several fitness clubs entered bankruptcy proceedings, while others were sold to satisfy creditors. Losing the companies damaged his pride, but it also forced him to stop living beyond reality. Nearly a year later, I learned he had accepted a management position with another organization. For the first time in decades, he no longer introduced himself as the owner of an empire. He simply introduced himself as someone doing honest work. Meanwhile, the Ashcombe Engineering Scholarship Foundation awarded its first group of students. I attended the ceremony myself. Watching young men and women receive opportunities they never thought possible reminded me why I had changed my will in the first place. My wealth was no longer waiting to rescue poor business decisions. It was building futures that had not existed before. Some of my children gradually visited the farmhouse again. We shared meals, celebrated holidays, and rebuilt trust one conversation at a time. The process was slow because genuine trust cannot be restored with a single apology. It grows through consistent actions repeated over months and years. When people hear my story, they often ask whether changing my will was an act of revenge. It wasn't. Revenge tries to destroy. Responsibility tries to protect. At 70 years old, I finally understood the difference.